you everybody for being here. And this is kind of a 101 basic version of the history and basics and primary focus and land use patterns from the Pickens County Code. So please let me know if you have questions along the way. This is kind of awkward for me to be yeah, if I face the owl, then I can't see if people have questions or what's going on. But please just let me know if you have questions. Ellen can watch the screen a little bit more maybe, and we can go from there. So anyhow, thank you for being here. And I think most of you that I see on the screen, other than Joe, probably, and Jessica, and probably Jennifer, don't have a lot of background with the land use code. So I wanted to give a little bit of history and just start off by saying that the Pickens County history for land use is pretty unconventional. It's all about the people. It's all about the past and some events that happened back in the 70s that kind of shaped and formed who we are today. And we are so fortunate that we still have many of those people around to help us with what was going on. At the time, there was a group of very smart, young, energetic folks, many of whom were attorneys who had moved to Pickens County. And they saw at the time the economy was booming, that there was potentially a lot of out of control growth that could happen. So they put their heads together, and the elections that occurred at the time allowed certain land use patterns to begin and take place. If you recall, we had Joe Edwards, we had Dwight Shellman, and Michael Kinsley. They were kind of our three people who are noted with the creation of our growth management system. And along with those people, I'd like to also note, Joe Wells is here to help us and able to help walk us through anything that might come up that I might miss or get wrong. We also have people in the Valley like Bill Kane, who's now the mayor of Basalt. We have Alan Richmond, Sonny Van, and Glenn Horn, who's part of our team with our new committee, with our advisory committee. So please feel free. I'm going to just volunteer any of those people to help give some history as well, if you run into them or want to hear their perspective on things. But they really were the people that were creative during a day when I would say land use was just kind of getting its feet underneath it in the state of Colorado. The state laws were more enabling at the time, and they allowed us to kind of create our own system, if you will. The attorneys at the time for the city and the county, we were a joint system at the time where we had the city of Aspen and Pickens County working together on our growth management systems. The city and the county have had to have two separate land use codes. As you know, Pickens County, and what we're talking about in our group, is unincorporated Pickens County. It's not the municipalities, the city of Aspen, the town of Snowmass Village, or Basalt, because they have their own land use codes. But I think it's critical to note that we want to work with those communities, because those are the hubs that drive a lot of what we're going to talk about during this time together with the group. So I just wanted to start with the fact that we are encumbered by some state laws, but mostly they're enabling for us. We're able to use our zoning powers, and we're able to use some environmental regulations out of the state to help us form what we want. And our history is rich with people who took risks and were bold. And I believe that that's part of our culture. And I believe that that is who we are from the, when we went around the room the other day and everybody was talking about their 2050 vision and their thoughts about who we are and our character and our background and how we all relate to this place. I think it's because of such rich history and it just comes all the way up through the local government. And I, for one, am very happy and proud to have been a part of it and hope that you guys will understand a little bit more about how Pitkin County and even the city of Aspen have done a great job of laying some foundation to make this a very unique and special place. So with that, I'm going to start off now by talking about how the code is formed, how the land use code is formed, and what that's made of. And we start with values, and we started that way the other day with our group, and we hope to get into that more next week. But really, the land use code is hopefully just a reflection of the values of the citizens. And that's what it's meant to be. And master plans are another way of expressing those values. And how we do that in Pitkin County is we're required by state law to have what's called a comprehensive plan. And we have a comprehensive plan that is an overarching plan for the entire unincorporated Pitkin County. But we also have master plans that are more neighborhood oriented. So, and you've heard about caucuses in Pitkin County. So most of our master plans are formed by the caucus group, by the citizens themselves, who say what they're interested in, what their values are, and what they would like to see happen in their neighborhoods as well as the rest of Pitkin County. So we start with a values approach just inherent in the way we look at the preparation of the land use code and the regulations. So just very basically, we've got, oh, she's here. Come on in, Chrissy. Yeah. Come on in.
Oh, sure. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you.
Chrissy, I'm so glad you're here. Yeah, we're already online with a bunch of people. So hi. And Chrissy, you'll have to just look at the very beginning again to get a feel for it. But we're still pretty much in the beginning, and we're talking about how the land use code is really hopefully just a reflection of the values of the citizens of the county. And how we get to those values is often through our citizen outreach, like we're doing now, and hopefully doing a recalibration, if you will, of those citizen values in a new setting today, and through master plans that the neighborhoods themselves develop. And you've heard of caucus master plans, and many of you are within areas that have caucuses in your neighborhood. And those caucuses in unincorporated Pitkin County, I think we have 11 of those now, Ellen, maybe 12 with the new formation of Brush Creek. But we have caucuses that develop master plans, and those master plans are required to have several things in them according to state law, and they're really weird, the things that you have to address. But we go well beyond those numbers of things that you have to address. So we talk about in the master plans what people feel about their neighborhood from a character perspective. They talk about what they feel from an environmental perspective, what they feel from a safety and security perspective, like with wildfire. And not only that, but the land use patterns within their neighborhoods. So hopefully we have then the ability to take those master plans, funnel those up into what's called the Pitkin County Comprehensive Plan, which is the requirement by the state. And that overarching comprehensive plan then outlines all our commonalities within each of these neighborhoods to give us our values throughout the county that we then take and we implement in the regulations of the land use code. And the land use code is the law, if you will. The master plans, while they speak to the values and all of that, they're more advisory and they guide us, but they're not the law. The law of the land is the land use code. And that code then has regulations that everyone follows. And you hear about those regulations throughout, the county. You hear about those regulations. I think we have a lot of people in our group, in our advisory team, that use the land use code. You have to know the regulations in your professions. If you're a land use planner, obviously to guide people in how to make decisions about their property, what they want to do with their property. We also have builders who have to know the land use code and know what's come out of the land use code in terms of the conditions of approval that have been set on a piece of property, so that then they can build to appropriately conform with those conditions. So the land use code, I believe, and I'm simplifying this a lot for those planners that are here and folks online that want to jump in, you can say more if you want, but from a very, very basic perspective, I believe that those values of the people have funneled down into 3 or 4 primary focuses within the land use code. Those are environmental. Number one, we talk about how important it is in our community to place our development in the right place. We don't want people being in a mudslide. We don't want people being in a flood zone. We don't want people being in a major wildlife corridor that then disrupts that wildlife movement. We don't want people being in unsafe conditions, and we also want to protect as much as possible those natural habitats and systems. The second thing I think that is really fundamental and a primary focus in our code is our character and our land use patterns, if you will. How we have, through the years, through the master plans and through our approaches, have had the philosophy that the communities are tight communities and that there should be rural open space in between the communities. That we don't want to, if you will, use the word sprawl in between the communities. And that was a pattern that was set up, gosh, years and years and years ago, but re-emphasized in a joint plan with the city of Aspen and Pitkin County, and also with our Down Valley Master Plan, which is an older plan, but in some places still in effect. And that is that there should be separation of communities so that we don't have, just as by way of example, Aspen and Snowmass bleeding together, that we have distinct communities with their own characteristics separated by unincorporated lands. And those unincorporated lands should be, for the most part, rural in nature. And then we get into our zoning patterns and how that comes into manifests itself in the regulations and in our zoning. So the next thing, the next foundation after environmental and character, I think really came out of that history that we went over in the 70s that was pretty cutting edge for the time in growth management. And it talked about pacing, the pacing of development. And that pacing, while we may not have always achieved it, it's kind of like the stock market. If you stay in it long enough, you're probably going to be okay, over time. Whereas if you look at it in one little pinch, you might freak out, like the 90s. I think the pinch in the 90s, we all went, oh my gosh, there's so much going on. But over time, our growth rates in terms of new development and our growth rates in terms of population, if you will, have been pretty steady and right under 2%, which is pretty remarkable for a place that's so appealing. There's obviously a lot of other social factors that go into that as far as the economy and being able to afford to be here. But with that, I think that'll set us off to have our discussion today. But the land use patterns, I think, very, very basically are urban, rural, very basic. And if any of you, I'll give an opportunity. That's a big overview of history, of the basic values, I think, that have come forward into the code via our citizen participation and our master plans. Our primary focus of the code being environmental, character, and pacing, and our primary land use patterns being urban and rural. With all of the complications that we get into with the land use code and how people go, oh my gosh, it's like brain surgery to understand our land use code. It's pretty basic when it gets to the fundamentals of what we're trying to achieve and where we come from. So I don't want anybody to think that it's a mystery, because it's not. It's basic. And then what's happened through the years is not so basic. It's complicated, it's connected, it's interwoven. If you move this part pops out, and that part pops out. But we can start to get into that and talk a little bit about that, because once you dissect it, it's not as crazy as you might think. And I know that everybody in this room is, and everybody on our group, if you can get the fundamentals, I think it'll flow for you as we go through this. And but never hesitate to ask questions. So I would, number one, just pause for a minute and ask anybody in the room or online if you have any questions, or Joe or Jessica or Jennifer, or anybody who uses the code a lot, anything you want to add that I've overlooked that you think is really important.
Cynthia, I see we have a chat, something in the chat box.
Oh, that's just
That
me.
was just direct messages with me.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Oh, come on, Joe. You're never fun. All right. Well, we'll take it that that's a good basic. How about anybody here? No? Oh, wow. Okay. Well,
I do have a question about pacing.
yes.
Is pacing a nice word for moratoriums on growth? I mean,
Well,
how do you
okay.
pace?
Pacing is something we'll get into with the management of growth, where you hear the growth management system is something that a very creative piece of regulation that was created back in the 70s. And that pacing and managing growth to be paced was part of that whole regulation system. Moratoriums are kind of a last ditch effort if your elected officials feel like you're in a crunch, that you need some time to work things out. Like there's no way, and things are just going to be too out of control if you don't just put a halt on development. It's just going to go crazy, and we just need to look at that. And over the years, we've had moratoriums in our history in Pitkin County. The one that's the most notable that I remember was in 2000, when we put a halt on development because there was unlimited square footage for homes, unlimited. The code did not address square footage. It addressed a house, like here's a house, build your house. And you could put up, as the Prince Bandar did, you could put up 43,000 square feet. You could do what worked for you. Unless you were in a zone district that had what we call a floor area ratio, and those are typically for smaller lots. Most of Pickens County having large lots, like 10 acres, 20 acres, 30 acres, had no restrictions whatsoever on size. So back in 2000, we were realizing the impacts of that and went through this whole discussion. Actually, in 93, there was a limitation. I think it was 93, Joe, where we put a 15,000 square foot limitation. But then in 2000, we realized that we had to do a little more refinement of that. And so this is another key point for the land use code. It's dynamic, it's going to change. And that's why we're asking you as our citizens to help us now as our advisory group to say, what needs to change now? We've been living with this land use code since 2006. So the most recent overhaul of our land use code was in 2006. And the code needs to be updated. It needs to be refreshed. It needs to reflect whatever's going on in the community, because as you know, things change. Who would have thought back in 1978 that people would build 15,000 square foot homes? Who would have thought, because back then, a home was probably 1,500 square feet. So you have to kind of keep pace with what's going on and look at the impacts of the community to the community and positive things that are going on for the community, as well as those that are potentially harmful or things that we may not be able to afford. We may not be able to afford it from a water perspective or from a traffic perspective or from any of those other perspectives. So we all need to, step back occasionally and do a refresh. And that's what we're doing now, and hoping that you guys can help us with that as the citizens. So, yep, we've had moratoriums and they're hard. And John Ely, who is our county attorney and someone that I've worked with a lot, and he's been my, partner in crime. And we and Ellen through long range have, been through a lot together in terms of changes to the land use code. And just kudos to John for being creative and being able to be flexible and work with us, in a very creative fashion. So I think the community owes a lot to his creativity. So we, with that, I don't know if that answered your question.
And I'm sure the entire next 6 months will be all around the levers that
Right.
we used for these three.
Right, and exactly. So, and Barb, one thing I was thinking about, we, as an educator, Pickens County, we've colored outside the lines a lot. And it's that part of, I think, I don't know, from an educator's perspective, but it's that part of when you have, I believe, a lot of passion and a lot of bright people who are dedicated to something, you're able to redraw those lines. And I think that's what we've done. And I think there's a lot of people who are really, they watch us. And I just like to say that this didn't really come out as much at our meeting the other night, but we are being watched by so many other communities right now with what we're undertaking as a community, because few communities have led with the passion for the environment, the passion for the place in relationship to our land use patterns, our character, and what we're all experiencing now with climate. So I think we're gonna be leaders in that. And I think you guys are gonna be the leaders in that because we've all batted this around a lot and it's up to the citizens to really give the commissioners the support and the focus to look at these issues. So my little 2 cents on that.
Did you guys see, there's an article in the Atlantic called End Times in Aspen, and it was written by one of the editors of the Aspen Times. But yes, very much former. Anyway, but it was revealing all the stuff that had happened with the Russian guy and all that stuff. But there's a great quote in which I'm going to tell my master, which is, this may be a small town, a small newspaper, but in view of what Aspen is, the eyes of the world are on Aspen. Similar to what you were just saying about Pickens County, and we fortunately or unfortunately happen to be in a place where what we do is watched.
Right, right. And yeah, on a lot of different levels. But for our focus on the land use, I could go off on all these asides, but every time we've done a major change to the land use code and the community goes crazy, like, oh my gosh, you're gonna ruin our economy or things are gonna be bad. We've gone back in history and we've looked at our valuations of our properties in Pickens County. And every time we've made a tweak, valuations have gone up like 30%. We can market because we've made this, you as citizens have allowed your elected officials and you've elected officials who have made this such a valuable place because you can't find it anywhere else. With that, do you guys feel like getting in the weeds just a little bit? Okay, so Kara, if you could, or maybe Emma, if you could bring up what we've termed the anatomy of the land use code. And thank you on the screen. And then I have a couple copies. There's one over here behind you. And there's one here as my cheat sheet that I'll. Oh, you can bring it down. You guys want to bring it down to the, you're welcome to, and there's a muffin. You're really good. Yeah, they're hard. They're kind of, they're hard to read as these ones. But yes, I know, they're so much fun. I know, they're how my brain works. Yes. So everybody who's gonna sit through this with us, I would recommend that you start where it says land use code. Towards the bottom of the page, it's a purple circle. And feel free to mark that up, do whatever you guys want. We can make you more copies.
Oh, we're gonna fight over this.
Yeah, do whatever you want. We've got
laminated.
Ooh. You sound like me.
Can everybody on screen see?
Can you see it? Now, I'm wondering if I should point on the screen, or do you want to help me do that, Kara? Okay. Maybe Kara can do that while
Cindy, I can circle things as you mentioned them.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you, Emma. Okay, so we're gonna look at the land use code. And that's what we're talking about today, just the land use code. Don't forget, we also have a building code that is very helpful that we'll go over another time because it's too much for one class. But as I talked about in our overview, basically this chart represents everything that I just talked about. If you start over on the right-hand side, where it looks at Pickens County Comprehensive Plan, right there, we just have a couple examples of plans that make up our comprehensive plan, if you will. Remember, the state law requires that we have a comprehensive plan, but they don't say how we have to do it. So we've decided we're gonna let the citizens speak to it through their caucus master plans. So we really feel like we get the most grassroots, if you will, information from the citizens at your neighborhood level. And then we've worked with other communities like Aspen, and we have a joint Aspen area community plan. And then we've also looked at things that are really important to the community, like climate, and we have a climate action plan. So
Who's we?
Picking County. Picking County. So everything I'm talking about here today is only unincorporated Picking County, but understand that we do hold hands with the other jurisdictions to try to do a good job of planning together. So I have other maps, but I'm just so afraid other people aren't going to be able to see them.
No, I gave them to, Emma has them electronically too.
Oh, okay. Well, if you want to, Emma, real quickly, could you go real quickly to the caucus area boundaries? Thank you. So on this map, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. There's a key at the bottom, but we have caucuses, and they're all in different colors of those areas that I'm talking about. And I think many of you live in those caucus areas. Joe Wells, who has been online with us, is the head of our Castle Creek caucus. He helps us get those citizens together to talk to us. If you go to the roundabout, the Castle Creek caucus comes up. Alan, you might be able to point out some, I don't know, as we move along here. Next to that, we have the Maroon Creek caucus. We have, as you go from east to west, as you go from Independence Pass, we have the east of Aspen caucus. We have the Woody Creek caucus. Then we go on down through the valley. We've got Snowmass, Capitol, Emma, Brush Creek. We have a new caucus at the Brush Creek intersection. And just from a land use pattern perspective, unfortunately, I should have made a map that was just going to be really basic. And that really basic map would look like, here's a blob around Aspen, here's a blob around Snowmass Village, here's a blob around Basalt. And each one of those areas have their own version of what I'll call the urban growth boundary. The city of Aspen has, along with Pitkin County, what we call the urban growth boundary. And that urban growth boundary defines in our land use code the difference between our urban part of our code and our regulations that speak to urban levels of development. And on the outside of that boundary, it speaks to our rural levels of development. And then you go over and you go on down to town of Snowmass Village. And the town of Snowmass Village, if you will, let's just say, it's got its blob around it, and it's got a big blob around it. Town of Snowmass Village has incorporated a lot of land, and I don't know if you can see that on this map, but the town of Snowmass Village has, has a large boundary. And the reason for that large boundary is kind of there are some fun factoids about it, but you know, it's an incorporated town. It wanted to take in, it took in much of the ski area, which is part of who they are for Snowmass Village. And then during my history here, I don't know how many of you know about the Wildcat property, which is probably about 8,000 acres in total. And the Wildcat property back in the 80s, late 80s, came under new ownership, and they wanted to subdivide. So they went through our growth management process, and they really didn't like our rules and regulations. And then they said, okay, we want to do something different. And we want to just have an exemption from growth management. And we have these exemptions we'll get into that we were trying to encourage people to, with these large tracts, subdivide large tracts. So they decided, okay, we'll be exempt and we're going to just subdivide, I think it was 12 500-acre tracts. Gosh, you know that. And so, is that where you live? No. No. Okay, so it's beautiful up there and it's beautiful land. And so each tract is now 500 acres. And so the code, let's use that as an example, drove and influenced that land pattern because they didn't like what they were getting out of growth management because it was too restrictive. But if they went with the exemption for larger parcels, there was a lot more freedom. But we still, in that regulation, we still said dogs are not allowed. Because this is up in Wildcat, it's prime wildlife habitat. And we said dogs are not allowed, but the developers were, this is important, people want their dogs. And so one thing led to another, and I'm not sure how much it had to do with dogs and how much it had to do with water rights and how much it had to do with whatever, but they negotiated with the town of Snowmass Village to annex into the town of Snowmass Village. So that is no longer an unincorporated Pickens County. So Wildcat is part of town of Snowmass Village. Little interesting way of weaving in how the code provides direction, incentives, and disincentives in order to get to our basic primary focus about environmental issues, character, and pacing. And so that was just one land use example back in the late 80s, early 90s when all that was happening. And then those guys were so frustrated with Pickens County that they decided to annex because they had, you have to have continuity, congruency with a border, and they did with the town of Snowmass Village, so they were able to annex. So that's just another way of looking at the code and zoning. So then you go on down the valley and we have Basalt. And Basalt, if you will, has its urban growth boundary, but Basalt, interestingly enough, is divided by both Pickens County and Eagle County. So it's just layered with regulations.
Is there Garfield in there somewhere too?
Garfield doesn't start until you get to Carbondale. But, so you have to go through Eagle County and then through Garfield County to get back up into the Crystal River Valley, which is Pickens County. So when you're driving up the Crystal, there's a little sign that says Pickens County. And when you pass that, then you're in Pickens County. And what you see along that corridor, the valley where the valley begins, are ranches that have been preserved through the Pickens County open space and trails in conjunction with the land use code. And we'll get into that more and more. It's another tool that we have. We have a tool that's called an open space master plan that has allowed us to conserve, gosh, I can't remember now, but I want to say in conjunction with open space and trails funds and with the land use code, I want to say that, I wish Dale Will were here, but I think we've conserved over 18,000 acres of open space just through that one program. And so when you're driving up that corridor, you can thank the land use code and open space and trails funding, thank you everybody, for the ranches along the way. And there are three, right as you're going up. You've got the Cold Mountain Ranch, then you've got the, oh gosh,
Avalanche?
no, it's the
The Wexner,
oh gosh, what's the guy, they run the farm, no,
Sustainable.
sustainable settings.
Oh.
And then you've got Sunfire Ranch, which is the Sewell family. All that land has gone under conservation easements and have limited amounts of development associated with it. So basically what you see along that corridor is gonna forever be preserved because of the land use code and because of the citizens of Pitkin County putting their money where their values are by supporting the open space and trails funding. So that's all woven in here. One more thing that I'll jump in with really quickly is the citizens of Pitkin County, along with our tourists, have supported our Healthy Rivers and Streams Fund because that is a sales tax, not a property tax. So over 50% of that tax comes from sales. It might be more now. Sales tax funding that helps support our ability to keep waters in the streams in Pitkin County and to help with that overall water issue on the western slope. So we've got some very good foundational environmental programs with the open space and trails, which protects not only agricultural lands, but wildlife lands and riparian habitat along streams. And then we've got the Healthy Rivers and Streams, which really works to preserve the water rights. And open space and trails now, when we purchase properties, they insist, that board insists that the water rights come with the property. So they're not severed and sold separately, and then the ground becomes fallow. It's all working together to keep water in the community. So that was a tangent, I'm sorry, but that is how our land use patterns work. So if you can visualize each one of our communities in the valley and unincorporated Pitkin County, there's Aspen, Town of Snowmass Village, and Basalt. Those have, if you will, and I'm using the term loosely because each community has their own term, but there's urban growth boundaries around those. And just so you know, an urban growth boundary includes not only a municipal boundary, but it also includes portions of unincorporated Pitkin County. Let me give you an example of the city of Aspen. Very broadly speaking, the city of Aspen urban growth boundaries, which were developed in conjunction with Pitkin County, are they're greatly set on where our utilities are. So if you go to, you're going up the pass, you get to about Mountain Valley, a little bit beyond there, the water line from the city of Aspen goes across there near the preserve subdivision right before you get into North Star. That's where the urban growth boundary line is. Then you go along the edges of the mountains on both sides, and we've taken into account, basically property lines and the bowl of Aspen from a visual perspective. And then as you go out down valley from Aspen, the urban growth boundary used to cut straight across the runway, because that's where the water line went. But now we've included it just didn't make sense to go to the end of the runway and then cut across and come back down, and it kind of gerrymanders around some properties there. But that's what we think about with urban growth boundaries. And within that urban growth boundary, people are served by water. And pretty much in that urban growth boundary, everybody's served by the Aspen Water and Sanitation District. But just so you know, as you're driving up, and you probably will never get this out of your head again, like I don't, when you're driving up, you go, okay, the land on the left side over by the animal shelter and the snow dump and all that, that's in Pickens County. The airport is in Pickens County. They're in the Pickens County unincorporated jurisdiction. The airport business center is still in the county. It's not within the city limits. So you're going along and then all of a sudden, certain properties are within the city and certain properties are within the county. And that is a patchwork right now that one day we'll get into. It is important, but that's how an urban growth boundary works. It's got both municipal boundaries and unincorporated boundaries. Lydia, did you have a question?
Sorry, I do. Somehow I got out of the system and I have a bad internet connection. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I noticed this in the paper as well, and you recognize the Cold Mountain Ranch Sustainable Settings and the Sunfire Ranch as conserved ranches, and Dale Will did in the paper as well. But the Flying Dog Ranch is also a conserved property ranch conservation movement. And I was kind of curious after I read Dale's article why we weren't mentioned, only because we're the oldest conservation easement, and I thought maybe somebody forgot.
We have never forgotten that you've done that, and it's great. I think I was just visually going up
Down the
the
corridor.
right-hand side of the corridor, but I think that brings up a really good point, Lydia. What I would like to put on a note, if you don't mind writing it down for me, Ellen, I think what we need to do is bring to the group a map of all of the conservation easements in Pickens County, because it's remarkable. Properties like yours, up, along the Crystal, and I don't have that fact in my mind right now on the Crystal, but I do for some reason in Snowmass. And if you go up to Old Snowmass, 50% of the private land in Snowmass is under conservation easement in that particular caucus. So Pickens County's got a long way with properties such as yours, Lydia, that give us, as we will see when we get into it, a much reduced build out potential based on our underlying zoning. So just keep that in mind. And a way to think about that for those of you who don't deal with zoning every day, let's just say I have a 10-acre parcel let's say I have a 100-acre parcel in a 10-acre zone district. That means I can have one house per 10 acres, 10 houses. But a conservation easement might come in and say, like in Lydia's case, I don't know your specifics, but in your case, let's just say you have that 100 acres and you said, we want to conserve all this land and put this in a conservation easement. And we really only want to have one house. So now we've got 100 acres with only one house. And so the net result is we're going to have less density than our underlying zone districts would have allowed us to have. And we're going to see that when we get into the numbers of what we have remaining in terms of potential build out in our communities. So thank you, Lydia. Was there anything else on that?
Well, I wanted to mention when we were talking about migration corridors, we here, and we're working with the BLM and the Forest Service, have been very affected by the migration corridor of hundreds of elk who used to be on the Crown and have moved from the Crown because there is no migration corridor there because of all of the disturbance. So I just mentioned that when we were talking about migration corridors, and so it's something I feel strongly about is preserving those.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think that that's all so basic to the values of this community and how those get reflected in an updated land use code. So thank you for bringing that up. And we hear that.
You know,
on
because
and
maybe they forgot we were conserved or something. So thank you, Cindy. Thank you.
Lydia. And thanks for jumping in. Thanks for not falling asleep yet. So here we are. We have if we could jump back to the graph of the anatomy of the land use code. Thank you. We had started off on the right-hand side and talking about how comprehensive plans of all flavors then funnel in with the values. Really, all those values from the ground up get translated from a non-legal perspective, from a advisory perspective, and get translated into a legal document called the land use code. And that is the process basically that we're working on with you guys as a citizens group. We're asking you, what are your values and what would you like to see in the land use code reflected then ultimately on the land? And so with that land use code, it's also influenced by what we were just talking about with the underlying zoning. That underlying zoning, I just kind of gave you that flavor of a 10-acre zone district with potential for 10 houses on 100 acres. Well, on top of zoning, not only does zoning talk about the density of a property and how much density is allowed on a property, it talks about where you can cite things on your property. As we talked about earlier in my introduction, how we really try to keep things out of harm's way. We try to keep things out of migration corridors. We try to keep things out of flood zones. We try to keep it out of mudslide zones. We try to keep people out of harm's way, if you will. And it also talks, underlying zoning also talks about what's allowed and not allowed. So in Pitkin County, a big focus that we're focused on with a lot of the data that we're going to be bringing to you is on residential, because the name of the game in Pitkin County is residential. We don't have a ton of commercial because commercial's mainly within our cities, within our towns. And we do have pockets, and most of those pockets are what we call pre-existing, non-conforming, because they were there before we had the concepts of our zone districts. An example is like Ashcroft, or Pine Creek Cookhouse, or or Mount what do they call that? The Woody Creek Station, little Conoco. There's some great gems out there that none of us would ever want to see go away. But they were pre-existing and non-conforming. And so to a large extent, those are not allowed to expand because we don't want to see, like the Conoco, you wouldn't want to see that become a shopping mall.
You mean the Aspen Village gas station?
Well, there is that. But I was talking about the Snowmass Conoco.
Oh, sounds.
Yeah, the old Snowmass Conoco right there. It's a pretty limited area for commercial. And the code would instruct us that we don't want that to sprawl. We don't want that to expand into, say, a new center for development of commercial nature. So the underlying zoning not only says, hey, we want to keep you safe on the land. We want to tell you what you can and can't do from a use perspective, commercial, residential, industrial. We want to talk about what the density is, 1 unit per 10 acres, 1 unit per 20 acres. 1 unit per 2 acres, whatever that is. And then we also want to talk about consistency with the character of the area. So each zone district, let's just take the zone district, the 10-acre zone district. If you were to read the code like our planning commissioner wanted you to, you would have gone to the zoning section of the code, and each zone district has an intent section. It says the intent of the 10-acre zone district is to have low density residential and agricultural uses. The intent of the zone district is to be rural in nature, that kind of thing. Each zone district has its own intent section, so you can read it and you can go, okay, now I understand what we're trying to accomplish there. One that you'll hear a lot about, and we're going to get into, I'm sure, as we move through this process, is the rural and remote zone district. The intent of that zone district is really, really, really low density, low intensity uses. And that zone district, if you'll walk through this bottom line with me, it talks about being consistent with the character of a backcountry area, not allowing new roads to be formed, not allowing new utilities to be developed, not allowing centralized utilities. It's all off the grid and keeping with the character of that backcountry. Then you go to the density and intensity of the development. And we went to the lowest possible density that the state would allow, which is 35 acres. And that's a whole other thing to talk about with state application of zoning, but there can never be greater than a 1 unit per 35 acres in the rural and remote zone district. Then you get into the allowed, and the intensity of development. We said, you know what, it's our goal in that rural and remote area to get rid of as much development as possible. So we created the transferable development rights. So if I own a piece of land in the rural and remote zone district, I can either develop a low impact cabin, no greater than 1,000 square feet. That's as much as you'll ever see back there now that the zone district has been implemented, or I can sell that development right for square footage. So if our underlying code says everybody in Pickett County has the right to have a house of 5,750 square feet, but I want to be bigger because I have a need to go bigger, I can buy your development right off of the rural and remote land that you on the private market can sell for whatever you want, but it has a value associated with it, 2,500 square feet. So we call that severing the development right off of the rural and remote property. That's the only zone district that allows that to occur as a zone district. There's other cases in the code that we'll talk about when we're trying to use that as an incentive and a tool to get to the intent of the code, to get to the intent of that zone district, which is let's keep this as open and as backcountry as we possibly can. So we incentivize that by saying you can take the development right off of that, preserve that property, it'll never be developed, and that value or that square footage is going to go somewhere else. And that was something that happened in the mid-90s when we created that. And I'll never forget the first phone call I got from a guy who had an old mining claim back there, and he goes, well, Cindy, I live in, Kansas City or wherever, and I think I could get 40,000 for that. And now they're selling for over 2 million for 2,500 square feet.
So is there, I understand that, is there a maximum in the code on square footage of a property? Is it still 15,000?
It is.
Are
And
there any exceptions to that?
yes. And there's just so much.
Yeah, I'm just
Yeah.
curious, so I.
No, no,
thought,
no,
you know, 12 yards. created 20,000.
You can still only use those 2,500 increments to get up to 15.
Right,
There are weird little provisions in different parts of the county based on whatever zone district you're in, whether or not there can be an exemption for underground square footage up to 4,000 square feet, whether or not your neighborhood, let's just go back to Snowmass Capital, they have said in their neighborhood that they don't want to see more than through their caucus master plan. They said, we don't want to have homes bigger than 8250, which is the use of one additional TDR. We don't want to see that. So here's how it worked. They said, we don't want to see bigger. So they put that in their master plan. It's an action item in the master plan that then goes to a code amendment to the Board of County Commissioners, P and Z and the county commissioners. And then it gets actualized in the land use code because the Board of County Commissioners go, okay, your neighborhood wants to only have 8250. All right, so now you go to the Snowmass Capital neighborhood in the land use code, and there's the circle around that that says these houses can only be 8250. You go up to Maroon Creek, and they've said we don't want to be bigger than 5750. You go up to Fine Can, and they say we don't want to be bigger than 5750. You go to Emma, they say we don't want to be bigger than 8250. So you've got pockets that say our neighborhood character, that our value is our neighborhood character needs to be smaller homes than allowed up to 15. But you have the neighborhoods who feel that their character is still 15. So you go to Owl Creek, you know, between the town of Snowmass and the city of Aspen. Owl Creek, we want 15,000 square foot houses. You go to east of Aspen, we want 15,000 square foot houses. You go up to Starwood, in that area, we want 15,000 square foot houses. Woody Creek, we want 15,000 square foot houses. There are different neighborhoods that want different things, and they've expressed that in their master plans. And so the county has tried to honor that as much as possible through time, but it's time to look at that again because the majority, or maybe half and half, have said we want to limit. So what does that do to the TDR market? And there's just different, we've got to look at it from all different angles. And it's really, that's where it gets complicated. That's where it gets layered, or that's an example. So how am I doing on time, everybody? Oh my gosh, we only have another 15 minutes or whatever. So I'll quickly run through all the parts of this. So you see, we've talked about the master plans, we've talked about the underlying zoning and what that means. And then there came along this thing called growth management, which is right, the bubble right above, thanks, Emma, the bubble right above the land use code. And I would say the growth management system, growth management WODA system is what GMQS stands for, is the foundation of, if you will, other than zoning, other than basic zoning, is the foundation of our land use code. And within the growth management system, this is where all the levers start. This is where we go, okay, we create this and this happens. But the fundamental part of the growth management system that I'll talk about right now is if you go above the circle on the right-hand side, there's competition. So what happens in a growth management system is twice a year, we have competition for residential development, and we have a competition for commercial and tourist development. We haven't really seen much competition on the commercial or the tourist side. We've seen most of the competition in the residential side. Excuse me, what do you mean competition? It's a closed bid system. So just think, you've got twice a year, I think it's September 1 and maybe July 1. I could be wrong on the dates because I don't do this anymore, but those, let's just say September 1 and July 1. Closed bid. 5 of you say, I want to subdivide my land. And you either do it yourself or you hire a planning consultant who tells you, okay, you have that 100 acres of land in the 10 acre zone district. You could underline zoning, get 10 units. But when you're in the growth management competition system, it's competition. So you have to make it sweet. You have to say, what am I going to do towards the values of Pickens County to make my development look better than your development? What is it that I can sweeten this pot with? What is it Pickens County cares about? We care about land conservation. So, okay, I'll reduce my density. I'll only do 5 units instead of the 10 that I could do. That'll make it nice. Oh, and I'll put a conservation easement on that. Oh, and the county really does value wildlife. So I will give $10,000 to upgrade the riparian habitat along the stream. So you give all these different things in your packet to make you look like you've got the most competitive application. So you're going to win because there's a scoring system, the growth management quota system. There's a limited amount of units or lots that will be given out every year. And there's a limited amount of square footage that will be given out every year. So you're competing either for a new lot or you're competing for new square footage. And the square footage ties into the TDRs because going through the growth management system is a way you might want to get additional square footage on top of your 5,750 square feet that's allowed by right, instead of buying a TDR, because not everybody can afford or can find a transferable development right to buy. So you can compete for square footage and you can compete for new lots to subdivide new lots in the community. This is where pacing comes along. There's a quota on how much you can develop or how much you can be allowed per year for a new lot, or how much you can be allowed per year for new square footage in this system. So that's the management of growth, if you will. Way back when in the 70s, that concept said, we're going to put a limit on how much can come out every year in terms of the pacing of what we're doing.
Give us an example of one of those recently.
Oh gosh, let's look at. I wish there was somebody from P and Z here. I just don't do this every day anymore. There was, let me do. Okay, let me look at, there was a recent one. Do you guys know the Oxenbergs along there in Woody Creek? They had a piece of land, and I don't know the details, but it's a piece of land that was large enough to subdivide. So they came in through the growth management system and they said, we have one piece of land. Let's just somebody's texting us. Maybe it's some good examples. No. Let's say it's 100 acres of land in a 10 acre zone district. And they said, we want 5 new lots on that land. And we're going to go in there and we're going to compete for that property with other people who want the limited number of lots are given out that year. And quite frankly, I can't remember that number right now that are given out per year. It used to be 7. I can't remember right now what it is, but I want those. And then let's just say somebody over in Emma had a big piece of land and they wanted to subdivide. And they wanted to win those lots. So you're competing for the number of lots every year. So the Oxenbergs, who just did it, they won because they did a lot of things. They made the houses small, they limited them. Small, they limited them to 5750. They made them somewhat invisible from the road, from the scenic perspective. They put a conservation easement on part of the property and then reduced their density that they could have had underlying zoning. So they won the competition for that. Yeah, I mean, that's just an example. We can get people who do that every day that give better examples. But then I'm not going to go into it because we don't have time on the commercial and tourist front, but that's marked in a different way. That's marked with how many employees are you generating, not how much square footage. So then, if you go up to, let's go straight up to historic objectives in this growth management. So hopefully that example I gave you talks a little bit about what we just said. There's a pacing involved right in the middle. There's a pacing involved. So there's only a limited amount of quota every year, given out, including square footage. And that was a change in the 90s. We used to not do square footage, but then there's the location part. We want you to be in the right location. Like the Oxenbergs, they made things invisible and they put things in safe locations. And then the growth part, like how much density, how much are you going to grow in terms of requesting? So with that, the scoring system is set up on what we're calling the benefits obtained. So when I said they look at your consultant or when you put your package together for your growth management application that is going to be competed with, you look at this top line and you say, okay, what are the community characteristics that I want to embody in my application? How am I maintaining and preserving community affordability and housing? How am I preserving our environment, maybe with conservation easements? And what am I doing from a civic or an institutional support perspective? The one that hops out at me years and years ago was, Prince Bandar gave the hospital something like a big X-ray machine or something. It was those, how am I supporting the community in all these different ways? And that's where the scoring system comes into play. So that's the body of growth management. It's a competitive system that helps us pace our growth and help get things in the right location. Not that we wouldn't have done that through zoning, but helps that be even more competitive. I'm going to stop right there because the next part are the exemptions and the exceptions to the rules. Does anybody right now have any comments? Joe, did I really fumble that? What else is there that we can add to this? Anybody have any questions? Have I totally confused people? Ellen, Kara, anybody?
Hi, it's Lydia again.
Hi, we hear you.
Could you please email this chart? I was going to try to screenshot it, but could you email that chart that's in front of us to us?
We have a great place for you to look for everything that we ever talk about. And Kara is going to remind us of all that because I never remember.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Lydia, it's on the growth, and for everyone, it's on the growth page, the community growth page under the resources. And I don't know if Emma, you can drive to it.
No, I can. That's fine.
Benefit.
I already saw because I was pretty good at looking at everything, but who knows?
It's under community benefits and it's called the anatomy of the land use code.
And it's the second bullet on there.
All right. Thank you so much.
There we go.
Emma's
Community
driving. There you go,
benefits.
right there.
Yep.
Thank you, Emma.
Thank you. God, this is such great, and then you have to rotate it. But, so real quickly, because I know we're running out of time and I really appreciate everybody. I don't even know if people are still on there other than Lydia. But, oh my gosh, people are hanging out. So thank you. So the next part of this growth management system and how our code works really is dependent on that foundational growth management system. And from there, we have exceptions or exemptions in the land use code that are trying to drive us to the values that we say we have today. So there are those incentives like you have with rural and remote. They're the incentive to say, I'm going to sell my TDR so that we can keep that land open and pristine in the background. That's the kind of incentive. What can we do to entice you to help us with all these community values at the top? And we've said over here on the left-hand side, you know, how can we move development to the appropriate places in the county? How can we move development to areas like through use of TDRs that'll help us get there? It's just one idea.
Backfire on you?
You what?
Had that backfire on you?
Well, as we see, after 20 years,
Yeah.
we now have different values about that. And there's history to that. When we first started the transferable development rights system, and this is important, because this is how you have to really pay attention all the time to the implications of what you're doing. We had the transferable development rights system all set up. And the only way you could use a TDR was within the urban growth boundaries to create new lots. So you could get out, you could be exempt from this competition system to create a new lot in the urban growth boundary. If you wanted to buy a TDR, you could say, hey, I don't have to go through this competition. I could buy a TDR and create a lot. Example of that is the old Pepke Ranch up on top of Red Mountain. They owned land on the backside of Aspen Mountain, and they took transferable development rights, one transferable development right for 35 acres, and they took 5 or 6 of those, and they moved that to the top of Red Mountain to their ranch, and they created those homes for the family up on top of the ranch. So they sterilized the land on the backside of Aspen Mountain. They put the new lots on top of Red Mountain within the urban growth boundary, and they didn't have to go through the competition. So that was a way that the original transferable development rights system worked. In addition to that, you could use that once the code changed and looked at TDRs not only as creation of new lots, but as square footage. The only place you could land that square footage was within an urban growth boundary. We tried really hard to get the city of Aspen and the town of Basalt to work with us within their urban growth boundaries to say, will you accept transferable development rights within your urban growth boundary too? Because we had 26, I don't know why I remember that, but we had 26 potential TDRs coming out of the frying pan. And we wanted to say, okay, Basalt, help us out by saying you will take some of that density for us within the urban growth boundary so we can preserve the outskirts. It never worked out with our codes to make that happen. With Basalt, it never worked out with our codes to make that happen with Aspen, but that was the concept. Let's all work together. Let's preserve this outer ring of backcountry and put the density where we want it to go. I believe there's still room to play with that within our urban growth boundaries. That's not necessarily even dependent on the municipality. So something to think about as we go down the road. But, that's just one example of incentives. So we had TDRs, we also created a conservation development that I think I talked a little bit about, where we would do what's called low impact residential subdivisions and conservation development planned unit developments. We have that 5-acre, 100-acre parcel that I talked about with the Wildcat. They said, we don't want to go through this. It's too much work, too scary. You're making us give up too much. We don't want to do it. We're just gonna carve it out to 500-acre lots. So we don't have to go through the competition. So in a way, the competition is a hammer. And we're trying to get our values through making an easier path for people to give what we're asking for to begin with. And the other things that are by right exempt from competition are pre-June 12th, 1978 parcels. So think about these old subdivisions like Brush Creek or like Mountain Valley or going up the Crystal. You know, we have all these little pockets of subdivisions. Those mostly were created pre-June 12th, 1978. June 12th, 1978 is when we implemented growth management. So anything that was created before that, you don't have to come in through growth management to get your right to develop. So it's kind of golden if you have a lot in an old subdivision, because you can just come in for a site plan and a building permit and you're good. You don't have to go through all this competition. So
Is
competition.
that happening a lot?
It did through the years, and there was part that was built into the pacing because when growth management first started, we counted that. So say you had a lot in Swiss Village subdivision on the Crystal, you came in and you got your building permit, and there were 7 residential quota units allowed a year. All of a sudden there were 6 because you already used one of our pacing. So if these old subdivisions people came in, which they're mostly built out now, but if they came in, say 5 people in Swiss Village came in with building permits that year, we would only have 2 available in the growth management quota system for competition that year. Now, that being said, there's variables on that too, because we always had a minimum quota available. But that was a theory. So that's my history lesson.
I have a question.
Yes.
You said something that said GMQS is the hammer, and we created all these other things that were to meet the values that didn't go through GMQS. I'm curious your opinion of, has that created too many, has that created too many exceptions that now they are those, is that still true? Is GMQS the hammer and all these other options are achieving the values, or are those things that are now too many exceptions and not meeting the values?
To replant that
That's a
question.
really good question, and it's so much better than me. Is it working?
Is it working?
Yes, that was a better way to say it, and I promise it wasn't, it was just like, oh, I got to hear this too. And
No, you're so smart. Yeah, no, it's not working. It's not working because now the values are shifting, I believe, a little bit. We have to create a new system of what we want. What are our new values, which is what we need to get out of all of you. What are those new values and how can we reach those? Because it's not only that, but typically, if you want a house over 5,750 square feet, you probably have enough money to go buy a TDR. And the competition Yeah, and the competition is time and money. And people don't want to wait, and they don't want uncertainty, which is the growth management system. So they'll buy the transferable development right. So we see less and less competition in the growth management system and more in the exemptions. So that's where we are. And great question. And then what a great way to set it up. Thank you, Kara, for kind of where we are today. And our system, it's a great foundation. It's served us well for 40 years in so many ways. And probably the characteristics of it are still valuable, but maybe not. Maybe we blow it all up. Maybe.
And, yeah, and I guess it's well said, Cindy, that the question is, are the exemptions that we've created still providing incentives that support the community values that are current today? So perfect question, and it's really a great springboard for why we're here.
That should be your inquiry question for the whole.
I'm also so glad this is recorded, because I was like, I can't write that, but that statement is.
That needs to be posed real clearly to all of us, because that's very succinct. And that's why I'm saying, yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for hanging in there and listening to me chatter for all this time. And I am available for questions. If anybody has questions, please email me. I will be leaving town on the 2nd of September, so you won't hear from me after that for 2 weeks, but I'll be back. Oh,
It's very well done.
thanks.
Thank you
Let me
so
go
much.
on.
Really enjoyed.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Anybody else online want to say anything?
I just have a quick question. Again, sorry, I'm a question asker today, but are you saying, and I was taking a lot of notes. So are you saying that TDRs are only usable in the urban growth?
That's how they used to be.
Used
And
to-
then the system got revised in 2006, maybe, that it turned into anywhere in the county that could accept the square footage, they could buy it. And I think that became a conflict with our character issues and the values. And so we didn't pay close enough attention to the implications of that change. And there, you have it.
Thank you very much.
Very, very helpful.
Thank you, guys. And yeah, call me anytime and I'll get back to you when I can. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Emma. Thanks, Abby, for hanging in there with us.
That was
Thanks, Cindy.
terrific. Thank you, Cindy.
Thank you. Bye.